to this discussion, this forum. Great that you made the effort to come out on what's a cold night. The structure of today's discussion, I'll provide you with an overview of the survey. And I particularly want to address the issue of reliability. Why do we think that this data is any use? Is it what the cat brought in, or is it actually something that has some reliability to it? And then we have, very fortunate to have 5 panellists, and they've been asked to speak, make an opening statement of about 5 to 7 minutes, and then over to you for questions. So the panellists today, I won't spend time introducing them because I think they're known to people. Rabbi Ralph Genendi from Caulfield Hebrew Congregation, Zeddy Lawrence. He's got the enviable job of being national editor of the Australian Jewish News, which is a very peaceful and, I guess, enriching experience. And Emeritus Professor Ilana Snyder from Monash University, and the New Israel Fund. Jennifer Hubbard, President of the Jewish Community Council of Victoria, and Daniel Kahan, National Treasurer of the Australian Union of Jewish Students. And it's actually great to see, Daniel, a number of young people who've taken the trouble to come along and interest themselves in this. All right, so without further ado, just to acknowledge our partners who provide very generous support. JCA in Sydney, basically Monash University, the Gandel Philanthropy Foundation, Australian Jewish Funders, and several, not least Tracy Olker and Simona are here from the Australian Jewish Funders, Beeson Family Foundation, Scher Family Foundation, and Jewish Care. Without their support, there would be no survey. So this survey has a very large number of respondents, 8,621. Had over 200 questions, took on average 45 minutes to complete. And just having a lot of people doing a survey actually doesn't get you anywhere necessarily. It has to be somehow reliable because it could be just one segment of the community, and so that doesn't really get you anywhere. The traditional way of doing surveys is a random sample. The problem with random samples is what do you draw the random sample from? If there's a central register, there is no central register of the Jewish community. There's more of one in Sydney than there is in Melbourne, but there isn't one in Melbourne. The other issue with regard to random sampling, and there's many issues, is that what they would do in America is they'll ring a couple of million people and they'll ask them, are you Jewish? And if you are Jewish in any way, they'll ask, would you be willing to do a survey? And through that process, which is really expensive, they will then construct a database and then random sample that database. And in America now, they're even having to pay people. So, for example, the recent Pew survey had to pay people even though they were after being indicating that they would do the survey. So I've probably done 20 national surveys in the last, probably since 2007. And we've done both probability samples and non-probability samples. And we've also done parallel surveys to what we've done here, invitation. The Australia at 215 survey, which is very highly regarded, was an opt-in survey. So the trick is, once you've got the survey results, to examine them and see if you can actually weight them so that they reflect the population. And you can weight a survey using various methods. But the census, Americans don't have the census because there's no religion in the census, so they don't have that baseline data. We've got baseline data. And then the other thing we did this time was that we actually, through various means, including the work of Adina Karp, who's here with us today, we spent quite a lot of time trying to get an understanding of the balance of forms of Jewish identification, so that we also use that as a weight. And The other thing that you look for is consistency in the data. Does the data tell you that you've actually tapped into the community or a segment of the community? So what we've got here is Sydney and Melbourne and the number of respondents, and you can see that they're pretty similar. And where you've got big differences, it could be an artefact of our surveying because we particularly went to a particular segment of the community, but there isn't a huge variation there. We've got large numbers. So one of the problems might be with this form of survey, it's online survey, that you're not going to represent the more elderly segment of the community. That could be a problem. But fortunately, elderly segment of the community, including my mother who's 90 years old, actually do have some familiarity with the internet. So we have, if we look at, that's just Melbourne data, if we looked at Melbourne and Sydney together, we have 1,300 to 1,400 people over the age of 70 who've done the survey. So the danger is if you're weighting on very small numbers, like 50, and you're boosting that could be very misleading. I could tell you lots of stories, but I won't at this point. So we weighted the data by sex, by age, country of birth, stream of Judaism, and the state that people came from. And the other point to understand is it's not just one survey, it's many surveys, because the methodology in Sydney was very different to the methodology in Melbourne. Because they got the JCA, they're able to use that to bring up people on board much more quickly than we were able to do that in Melbourne. So then when we compare Sydney and Melbourne data, is it similar or dissimilar given that they've used different methodologies? See, this is, we actually spend months analysing this data to try and see that it was reliable. This is just one indication of time when the survey was completed. And these are dates. So what happened in Sydney, they publicised it, they sent out an email to the JCA database and said, do the survey. Lo and behold, 600 plus people did the survey. Then they sent out a reminder a couple of weeks later, and you can see the second spike, and then they told people the survey's closing, you better do it now. So they're very responsive in Sydney. It's a command-driven economy. Here in Melbourne, we're anarchic, so we've got to go around, and we did everything possible, including to the point where, that Sunday in the park, not quite Sunday, in the park in Selwyn Street, where in one voice, yes? And I was schlepping, from Coles, large amounts of bottles of water to try to get people to sort of do the survey and get the water. It was a very hot day. So we had to work non-stop for a very long period, over 3 months, to try to get people to do the survey. Now, did we reach the unaffiliated? Because the danger is we're just going to tap into the affiliated. And you can see there that in Melbourne, 26% of respondents are unaffiliated. Also, they're not connected to the community. And in Sydney, 34%. Now, when we're talking about 8,000 plus people, that's a lot of people here. So we can start to understand them. So that we can look at patterns of consistency. Let's compare with the census. Let's compare with Gen08, the earlier survey, etc. So we spent a lot of time trying to get a hold of this. So what we've got here is comparing the census and Gen17. Now what would be a bad result is if that blue line, which says 53%, you see that? If that was 70%, because that would mean we're mainly looking at the areas where most of the Jewish people live. But you can see that it's almost lined up. And so on as we go down different segments, and these are suburbs with their proportion of the Jewish population. If we compare Gen08 and Gen17, in the area where we think we might get like similar sort of data, financial circumstances haven't greatly shifted, I wouldn't have thought, since 2008 in the Jewish community. Maybe a little bit worse, and that's what the data shows. A little bit worse, but amazing consistency between Gen08 and Gen17. Can you sort of make sense of that? 6% said they were prosperous in Gen08, 6% said they were prosperous in Gen17. In a way, it is true that this data is reliable. We did a survey that would have cost, do you know how much it would have cost to get these sort of numbers? $2 to $3 million. Because the only way that you can actually get someone to complete a 45-minute survey is if you actually interview them. Yeah, it means people going out and interviewing people at considerable length. That would have cost about $1 million in itself if you actually factor in the cost of that. And then all of the organisation, etc. So we're able to achieve something that's reliable. That's quite an amazing achievement of all the people that have been involved in this survey, and I think they need a lot of respect because people worked on this for over 2 years. Again, if we look at a question like, have you visited Israel? Never, once, twice, 3 or more times. And you look at Sydney and Melbourne compared. Like, isn't that amazing? Yeah. So my experience, having done a lot of surveys, is that there's a regularity and a pattern. And if you can go to all the different segments of the community and encourage them to do the survey, you can get some quite amazing results for what the community can afford. The community can't afford $3 million, but it can afford, and I think we get just as good a product. And what we're able to do then is, what's so important is it's not the aggregate for the Jewish community, but it's the streams of Judaism, and understanding what it means if you're a traditional, modern Orthodox, conservative, and then what are your attitudes. So we've got big tables in the survey that you can actually unpack what it means to have different forms of identification. By the way, if you want to get a copy of the survey, it's online. Go to ACJC website, or you can email us and we'll send you a PDF. Because what we're trying to do is encourage a discussion. So I won't go on much further. But you know, the sort of patterns that you see are very consistent. So this is the rates of intermarriage for the different streams of Judaism. And we can look at all marriages, or we can look at marriages over the last 7 years. And do you see the pattern? And it's a very strong pattern. And this pattern is consistent across the data. Attitudes towards Jewish day schools. So again, I want to emphasise that what we've got here is many surveys, and it gives us insight into different segments of the community. If we had a sample of 640, which is what they had in earlier Melbourne surveys, you can't disaggregate the data like this because you don't have enough respondents. And then you look at this data and you say, well, interesting. So my conclusion, and you'll hear from others in a minute, is there's an amazing continuity within the Jewish community. People here are doing something that's not been done in America. And the main aspects are the Jewish day schools and Israel connectedness. And I don't want to go on anymore, so this is my last slide. But if we compare Gen17 and the USA Pew 213 survey or the Boston survey, and particularly have you visited Israel more than once or lived in Israel? According to our survey, it's 67%, almost identical in Sydney and Melbourne, yeah? And look at Pew, 23% of Americans, or the more recent Boston study, 34%. You can still see that huge difference. All right, so thank you very much. And now the first of our speakers, Rabbi Ralph.
Thank you, Andrew. You know, Jews have been surveying Jews for a very long time. We have been, we are very outer-directed in some ways. Externally, we have a drive to reach out, to explain ourselves, to share our energy, and hopefully to share our visions and ideals. But we're also pretty inner-directed, and a drive to examine ourselves, all that Jewish angst about examining ourselves and Freud and our aspirations, our dimensions, our ideals, our idiosyncrasies. And when do you think the very first survey was? I'd say about 3,500 years ago, in the desert. What do you think Moses was doing when he took a census? I suggest that when he arrived and said to guys, I want you all to give Maxita shekel, half a shekel, there were a few of them said, what's it for? What are you going to use it for? Why should I give? You're giving, is she giving? What does it mean? Does it mean I belong if I don't give the half shekel? So he was a bit up in there. He managed to survey 600,000. But maybe he had some other forces to help him along the way there. But I must say, kol hakavod for this current survey, which is spectacular in terms of what you've done, and all of those who put so much work into it. It's large, it's impressive, it's challenging, it's reassuring, it's worrying, it's provocative, it's predictable. In some ways, I found it predictable because it kind of, for myself, being kind of intuitive, anecdotally moving around the community. Yes, I know that. I know that we are growing in terms of secularity. I know that intermarriage is on the increase because the number of people are coming through my office and anecdotally people telling me about it. I know that educational costs in Melbourne are a huge worry. Social attitudes are clearly changing. Shul attendances are changing. Connectedness to shuls is certainly something that I can see and I live with and see it's affecting a large swathe of our community. But having it confirmed by all of this data, it's confirming, it's reassuring in a way, but it's also concerning. But most importantly, I think it gives, and what has been suggested, it gives weight, it gives precision, it gives direction to our decision making, certainly across the community, and certainly with those of us who move within shul communities, it gives us a lot there to think about. It's reassuring in some ways. One of the ways I find very reassuring that the South African migration is so large, and we vexatious Litvak Africans are making such a mark on Australian Jewry. It's also reassuring that the bagel belt of Melbourne is fresh and crusty, crustier and fresher than Sydney. We're doing better. We're more intense Jewish experience that we have here, as is expressed in the survey, that with all our feudalism and our diversity, we have a great range of bagels. Plain bagels, multi-seed, sourdough, wholemeal. We're a wonderful mix, which certainly was confirmed by this. But if I had to select a few points, and I think it's kind of preliminary, just reading through it, and I think there's so much there to think about, to examine, to research, to talk about, and will continue to challenge yourselves and all of us across this community for a while. Yes, intermarriage, I think that we all knew, is growing, albeit slower here than in Sydney. Parents are caught, and it's interesting because the parents, as where people are asked, what do you think about it, concern about it, what do you think about your own kids, far more tolerant when it comes to for our own kids. Judaism still is a central, significant element in the lives of our community. It's highly, like 66%, Jews still feel highly connected or feel connected, and of course that high connectedness to Israel, which is not something which is mirrored in other countries. But Jewish identity, part of what this said to me is just how vexatious Jewish identity is, and how vexatious it is defining Jewish identity. And reading through it, I was getting confused. It's confusing, it's compelling, it's contradictory. There's this high level in terms of the Shoah being there, the Shoah being the attitudinal, and remembering the Shoah. 95% of people say that is something that is important or was close to very important, remembering the Shoah. Upholding strong moral and ethical behavior, really high up there in the 90s as well. Learning about Jewish history, very high. But then I wondered, when I look around and see, yes, everyone says it's so important that we uphold strong moral and ethical behavior and remember it, but are they underpinning it with Jewish literacy? I go around and see the number of adult education classes around across the board, Jewish educational things. It's not like 95% or 90% or even 80% of our community are involved in making themselves more literate, and I still worry about the Jewish literacy of our community. I'm not even talking about religious literacy, I'm just talking about Jewish literacy. And so there seems to be a bit of a gap, as I imagine there are in surveys of this kind, between what people say is important and then what they do. So between the difference between what they say and then what they actually go out and do. So there's a growth we are concerned about intermarriage, but are we doing anything about it? Are we educating ourselves more? The Mishnah, famous Mishnah says, Ezehu Chacham, who's wise, Haroet HaNolad. It says the person who can see the future, can see that which is going to be born, although the Hebrew itself is HaNolad, means it's already been born. And it was an Afrikaans poet, it's the same guy who may have written one of the anthems, Langenhoven, some South African here may know it. If you're ahead of the time, he said, if you're ahead of the time, you can wait for it. If you're behind, it won't wait for you. And I think a survey like this tells us, are we ahead or are we behind? Have we accepted that change is here? And I think that what the survey certainly for me is indicative of the kind of change that is happening within our community as it is happening globally. We're living in an exciting era of change, one of the radical revolutionary eras that we are living through here. But when one looks at some of the issues that are of concern, the top ones, of course, were in terms of Israel, and but there were other top-ranked issues. But among the top-ranked issues were two that stood out. The largest respondents were increased Jewish day school fee assistance in here in Melbourne. We can see that when one opens their eyes and can see the problems that are around. And the other one was concern. You don't feel indicated what reason do you feel. And one issue was we need to reduce, what the community needs to do to improve is to reduce religious division between Jews. Very high one up there. I wondered, it's not clear to me exactly what religious divisions mean. It can mean a whole variety of things. That mean, between religion, between Orthodox and Reform, is between Orthodox and Haredi, between Haredi and the rest of the community, or is it all of the above? What do we need to do? Have the dialogue. What do we need to do with it? So one of the strongest and important questions I think for anybody involved and cares about the community is how do we strengthen our community? How do we move forward? How do we come, and there are the voices there are saying we should be more tolerant and inclusive, and we need to pay attention to those who are intermarried and not to make them feel excluded, and there is no place for them, particularly within the Orthodox community. Yes, it's obvious also to say, yes, intermarriage is increasing, but you look at it, that the ultra-Orthodox are doing the best, and modern Orthodox then are doing better. And it's easy to say, well, just become more frum, sign up, we'll put on tefillin as you go out the door. Oh, we don't do it at night, but all right. We'll find something else, we'll make you more religious, and then you can be ensured we will proof you against intermarriage. It's obvious to say that kind of thing, but it's not so obvious to say, how do we make our community, people aren't going to just feel more religious or become more religious, connected. I think the issue is how do we make Jews feel more connected, and connectedness, and that which implies in schools, but all of our organizations, that we also need to look at our organizations and say to our younger generation that they need to come in and take them over, reshape them, reform them, don't reject them. And that we need to become more open and tolerant, particularly in our Orthodox schools, and recognize as well that people connect to Judaism in so many different kinds of ways, which to me that is what the survey is emphasizing, is that there are so many different portals, so many different entree points into Judaism that we need to pay attention to. One of the most interesting things, and I think it was highlighted in the Jewish news at Pesach time, was that Seder, the observance of Seder observance is still right up there, that most Jews, regardless of their level of connectedness, have some kind of Seder or attend some type of Seder. And why is it that Pesach captures the imagination? The Seder captures the imagination of so many Jews from so many diverse backgrounds. To me, part of the answer then, what we need to do, lies in the answer to that question. Because if you think about that Pesach experience, which was one of the most brilliant innovations of Judaism thousands of years ago, was that it is multi-generational, it's family-oriented, it's interactive, and if your Seder isn't interactive, we can help you make it more interactive. If it isn't multi-generational, it's all about food, it's all about history, and we see a lot of Jews, they said we care about Jewish history, and it's also about those social values which we are seeing are increasingly important, particularly to our younger generation. Those social values, because that's what Pesach is about. It's about freedom. It's about the dignity of human beings. It's about the vision of creating a better society. It's about, not just about that unleavened bread that lies flat and challenges us with intestinal fortitude. It's not just about that lechem, but if you turn around the words lechem, lamed, mem, you get chalom, which is to dream. And it's not bread. We don't only need bread, we need roses as well. We need bread, we need dreams. And it's our dreams for the community, and I think for the future, which is encapsulated on that magical Pesach evening. The kind of community that we wish to have, to build, to into, and to enhance the kind of community that we already have. So in conclusion, You know, that was a few thousand years ago, Moshe ran into some problems. If you remember, first time around, people were fetching and complaining. We want water, we need water. Moses, what does he do? Hit the rock, water came out at Soda Street. Fantastic. 40 years later, Moses, same time, complaining, fetching, we want water, we want water. God says, well, Moses, Moshe, speak to the rock. Instead of speaking to the rock this time, he does what he did before. He clubs the rock, he hits the rock, he strikes the rock, and the water doesn't come out from that time. He gets it in the neck for that. What's the difference between the two? There were two different kind of generations. The first generation had just been released from Egypt. They were the first to experience freedom. They had just left Egypt. They knew what it was to be a slave. They knew what it was to be abused. They knew what the stick stood for, and they could respond to a stick. The next generation had grown up. They were born into freedom. They were the wilderness generation. They were the Gen Ys and the millennial generation. They saw things differently. You don't approach them with a stick. You speak, you communicate, you talk. And I think in some ways, what the part of our survey is saying as well, we need to be careful to find the right language to recognize our community is changing in many kind of ways. Let's respond, not with big sticks, not with fetches, not with complaints, not with trying to hit people, look what's happening in the OFA. Rather, let's communicate, we can find the right kind of language in this new age that we're living in. We're an incredible community, and I think that is what is emphasized by this survey as well, and we will find a way moving forward with energy and direction.
The story is told of the yeshiva that decided to enter a team in the Commonwealth Games, and they were particularly keen to get involved in the rowing, and they couldn't understand why race after race they lost. So after they lost their final race, they got together, they sat around and they started chatting about it, and after an hour of chatting, one bright spark from the back of the room says, you know what it is, you know what I've noticed? The other teams, they've got one guy shouting and 6 guys rowing. We've got one guy rowing and 6 guys shouting. And the Rosh Yeshiva thinks for a moment and he says, you know what? We need a stronger rower. And that is very much what our Jewish community is. 6 guys, all shouting, and people like Andrew trying to pull us all in the same direction. But everybody has a different view of what that direction should be. And that's something that we see very clearly every week in the Australian Jewish news. Andrew said it was an enviable task. Believe me, there's nothing enviable about it. In the sense that we are supposed to represent or reflect the community on a weekly basis as opposed to every 8 or 9 years when there's a survey. What do we see when we look at the letters page? We see people on the right, when it comes to Israel, lambasting people on the left. These people on the left who want peace and can't see that there's no solution, they're as bad as Hamas. In the meantime, the people on the left are looking at the people on the right and attacking them and saying, I hate to use the expression, but they write to me and they say, these people on the right, they're worse than the Nazis. And it's terrible language that people are using, attacking each other. They can't see that there's a middle ground. Everything becomes personal. You don't just have a difference of opinion in our community, you actually hate the person who has a different point of view. And that's also the same when it comes to debates on religion in the newspaper. We have people who write to us who are orthodox, and they write that people on the progressive, that people who are progressive are destroying our religion, that they're the enemy of Judaism. And then we've got people on the left who defend themselves and say that the people on the right are turning people away from Judaism with their strictures and with their moralizing. And then we look at issues that have arisen over the past couple of years that create even deeper schisms. Whether it's same-sex marriage, whether it's refugees, whether it's the child abuse scourge that hit our community. Everybody is polarized when they write to the Jewish news. People who are in favour of same-sex marriage are destroying society. People who are against same-sex marriage are destroying society. People who are encouraging Australia to take more refugees are destroying our country. People who want us to take less refugees are destroying our country. People who speak out against the scourge of child abuse, covering it up. People who are advocating that we tackle child abuse, they are destroying the community. Then there are debates about who speaks for our community. Is it the Executive Council of Australian Jewry? Is it the Zionist Federation? Is it AJAC? Is it the Anti-Defamation Commission? Is it the Australian Jewish Democratic Society? Is it the Australian Jewish Association? Is it the New Israel Fund? Is it the Jewish Community Council of Victoria? Everybody has a point of view, and everybody is trying to fight their corner and saying, we are the authentic voice, we speak for our community. And though they do it quietly, they talk each other down. There are deep schisms and deep rifts within our community, and it's visible within the Australian Jewish news every week. And if you only read the Australian Jewish news to get a picture of our community, you would think that we all hate each other and there's no unifying ground in our community. But then you look at Gen17 and Gen08 before it, and you see that for all the divisions and all the rifts and all the polarisation, there are a lot of things that bring us together. As Rabbi Ganendi mentioned, even though less than half of us feel that believing in God is a central element of our Jewish identity, at least 90% of us, nonetheless, will attend a Seder. As Rabbi Ganendi said, 95% of us believe it's important to remember the Holocaust. 90% of us feel that it's important for us to be part of the Jewish people worldwide. Despite all the things that divide us, there's so much that we see in the survey that brings us together. Now, a couple of the things that stood out for me when I read through the results is that Israel, perhaps, is not as central as we might like it to be. In a strange quirk, only 69% of people in our community say that they define themselves as Zionist. Something that I found quite shocking, particularly when I then look at the statistic that says that 88% of people feel a personal responsibility to ensure the Jewish state continues to exist. Now, some people might say, well, if 88% of these people feel personally committed to ensuring the Jewish community, the state of Israel exists, surely that 88% of people are Zionists. And yet only 69% of people define themselves as Zionists. So how does this come about? Is it an indication, perhaps, that certain labels such as Zionism are looked at the wrong way? Rather than defining Zionism for themselves, do some of us in our community now see it in a negative light because of the way that the word Zionism has been taken up by Israel's enemies? This is just one of the many questions that arose for me when I was reading through Gen17. As Rabbi Ganendi said, one of the other big questions, 1 in 3 marriages that we have in our community are intermarriages. Do we care? Should we care? If we do care, what are we going to do about it? What concrete steps are we taking and were taken after Gen07 to address these issues that we consider to be so important? What was done to tackle the problem where so many people in our community see education as invaluable, Jewish education as invaluable, and yet so many of us sacrifice to pay for that education for our children? Now, we know in Sydney we have the JCA, which actually looks at the survey and addresses these questions and will prioritise the way they give funds and the programs they set up in order to address these issues. But what mechanisms do we have in Melbourne to address the results and the issues that arise from the survey? What concrete steps? This is a question that I'm asking, and I hope that people like Andrew will be able to answer. What concrete steps were taken in Melbourne after Gen07 to address these issues, and what concrete steps will be taken after Gen17 to address these issues? So many questions arise. There's so much, as Rabbi Ganendi said, that we can be positive about, that we can dream about. But it's all very well to dream, but as Theodore Herzl said, if you will it, it is no dream. Where is the will? What concrete steps are we taking? That's what I want to hear from Andrew and the rest of the panelists this evening. Thank you.
Maybe you'll be able to see very quickly that I'm from the university. My background is in the university, and I've taken a much more academic approach to than the first two speakers. But I hope that you'll appreciate the analysis that I want to present to you. Now, okay, as Gen17 shows us, the Australian Jewish community is more diverse than people have tended to think. It's made up of many overlapping smaller communities which have their own characteristics. Now, the New Israel Fund, NIF, is my community. NIF is a global organisation that supports Israel and works to end discrimination and injustice. And we share values and we realise those values through the grants we make in Israel to a range of not-for-profits. We're deeply invested in Israel's future as a democratic homeland for the Jewish people. Our Israel is both Jewish and democratic. So when we looked at the findings of Gen17, we were particularly interested in responses to the questions about Israel by people who more or less reflect the profile of our supporters. In the Israel section of the survey, respondents were asked how connected they feel to Jewish communal life and if they keep up with events in Israel. Other questions covered their views about different aspects of the Jewish state: democracy, corruption, treatment of minorities, and the influence of Orthodox Jews. There were also questions about the peace process, land for peace, the West Bank, and security. So we asked Tanya Munns and Andrew Marcus to prepare a more refined analysis of the items in the Israel section, taking account of 6 variables: age group, how connected respondents feel to Jewish communal life, country of birth, whether they went to Jewish day schools, whether they attended a youth movement, and the extent to which they keep up with current events involving Israel. And the analysis produced some very interesting results. Among the various age groups, young people, that's 18 to 29-year-olds, held the strongest views on a number of items. 52% believe there's too much corruption in Israel's political system, and 52% believe that non-Jewish groups suffer from discrimination. Compared to the other age groups, more young people strongly disagreed that democracy in Israel is alive and well. They more strongly agreed that Israel should give up land for peace, and they more strongly disagreed that control of the West Bank is vital for Israel's security. Compared to the students who went to other schools, those who went to Bialik, King David School, or Emmanuel in Sydney held the strongest views on the same items. There's too much corruption in Israel, too much discrimination against non-Jews, a higher proportion disagreed that democracy is alive and well, and more strongly agreed that Israel should give up land for peace. Relative to other groups, they more strongly disagreed that Israeli control of the West Bank is vital for Israel's security. And as for those who feel unconnected to the Jewish community, they tended to be more critical of Israel on all of these items. When country of birth is considered, those from Israel tended to be more in tune with the views of Israelis and the more progressive views expressed by young people and respondents who went to Bialik, King David, or Emmanuel. They believe that Orthodox Judaism has too much influence in Israel, there's too much corruption and discrimination against non-Jews, that democracy is not alive and well, and that land should be surrendered for peace, and they disagree that the West Bank is vital for Israel's security. Those from South Africa tended to be more conservative in their views on all these items. The respondents who attended youth movements tended to hold similarly more critical views of Israel, and those more informed about current affairs in Israel tended to be more critical on issues such as the power of religious Jews in Israel, discrimination, etc. Now, as strengthening democracy in Israel is the focus of our work at NIF, we looked at a 2017 survey in Israel carried out by the Israel Democracy Institute, which is an independent centre of research and action. The study was based on a large-scale public opinion survey conducted in May 2017, and the survey constituted a representative sample of the adult Israeli population. Now, the finding most relevant for comparison with Gen17 is that when asked if Israel's democracy is in danger, some 45% believe that Israel's democratic system of government is in serious danger. 41% of the entire sample believe that Israel used to be more democratic than it is today. In Gen17 in Australia, only 13% tend to disagree that democracy in Israel is alive and well. Thus, it appears that more people in Israel believe that democracy is in danger than in Australia. In a speech last week at a conference in Jerusalem to mark 70 years of Israeli democracy, organised by the Israel Democracy Institute, President Ruvi Rivlin said, quote, "We are strong enough to build strong institutions for our democracy, institutions like civil rights, the court, the police and a state army, headed by excellent people, real patriots, while at the same time we are strong enough to absorb criticism of those institutions, provided it does not become delegitimisation. We are strong enough to criticise our leadership without worrying that through this criticism we are also harming the strength of the State of Israel." Now at NIF, we wonder why more people in Israel are concerned about the institutions of democracy than the Jews in Australia.
Thank you. I'd like to actually start by thanking the Australian Centre for Jewish Civilisation for inviting me to participate in this forum, and also to commend them for the work of their work in carrying out this survey and the other participants in the survey. I think it's a very valuable resource for our community for a number of different reasons. I've come from a different perspective than the previous speakers. I've looked through the preliminary, which I know are only preliminary report, and that there will be a lot of more detailed reports done over the next year or so, pulling out more detail about particular pieces of information. What we've done is looked at what some of the key issues we feel that the JCC can be involved with for the information that's contained in the preliminary findings from the survey. And I think before we can do that, we have to talk a little about what the role of the JCCB is. I think Andrew has quite clearly, and as some of the other speakers quite clearly explained, there's a big difference between the Sydney and the Melbourne communities, and this comes out in some of the responses to the survey. The JCCB is a roof body. We represent 50-odd affiliate organisations who themselves represent particular sectors of the Victorian Jewish community. We don't provide services to the Victorian Jewish community. We don't provide funding to the Victorian Jewish community. We have specific aims of representing the community to external bodies, the government, non-government organisations, other community organisations, and strengthening the Victorian Jewish community by providing support to our affiliates, combating anti-Semitism, oversight at CSG, and providing a forum for community members who are not aligned with any particular religious or ideological viewpoint to come together. And through the ACJC, we're connected to Jewish communities around Australia and internationally. So having that in mind, what does the Gen17 preliminary findings say about what we at the JCCB will do over the next few years? I think, as some of the previous speakers have said, there's a lot of positive information about our communities. Somebody asked what was done after the Gen08 survey, and I know that a lot of our Jewish community organisations use the information in that survey for their strategic planning. Organisations such as Jewish Care and other service providers within the community did actually look very closely at that information for their strategic planning. But unlike Sydney, we don't have community-wide strategic planning because we don't have a community-wide fundraising. And without that, it's very difficult to do strategic planning on a broad community-wide basis. But we do look from the JCC's perspective, we look and see what it is that areas we should be involved with. We also use it to inform our discussions with government. It's very useful for us to be able to go to the government when we're talking to them about allocating resources to the Jewish community, dealing with issues of concern to the Jewish community, to be able to provide them with some statistics behind those requests. And this is something that stands us apart from many other communities. And whenever we meet with government, they say, look, the Jewish community has this information, statistics it can use to inform decision making, and that actually stands the community in good stead, and very often leads to really decisions from government, whether it be the current government, whether it be a Liberal government, doesn't matter. But they all appreciate that the community is concerned at finding out about itself, finding about what its needs are, and then approaching government and non-government organisations with some statistical background to the requests, and that actually is very important for decision making that affects our community. So I think that's one of the things that really comes out of that is the real benefit of a survey like this. It's very important. And one of the things that we try to do when we represent the community, when we're dealing with other organisations, is talk about the diversity of our community. And the information in this report about the ways different people connect to being Jewish is really important for that, and it provides statistical some support for those arguments. Rabbi Genendi made a comment about the different ways people connect to the community, and that's something that we think is really interesting. What was interesting, I found in particular, was that 32% of respondents who did not feel connected identified the reason for that not feeling connected was their secular outlook and lifestyle. Now that shows that we've got a lot of work to do, because our view is that the community, although Judaism is of course a religion, the Jewish community is much more than that, and we acknowledge that people connect to Judaism in very many ways. People see it as a culture, tradition. Obviously, some people see it as a basis for their social and moral background, outlook on life. Over 90% of people say that that is an important part of their Jewish identity. So I think we've got to do a lot of work at saying that the Jewish community is not a particular section of the community. So what we, I think, at the JCCB will be looking at is how we change that perception of our community, how we make people understand that the community is not any narrow part of that community, but the broader community as a whole. The largest single response to a question about how important an issue is to your Jewish identity was Holocaust commemoration, shared by over 90% of the community. Now, to a certain extent, that talks about the nature of our community, the large number of Holocaust survivors who found their homes in Melbourne and the impact those survivors have had on the makeup of our community. But as we move further away from the Holocaust, and as younger generations take up leadership roles within our community, it also poses a challenge. As we move further away from the Holocaust, where the relevance of the Holocaust perhaps is not as important for many members of our community, in the future, how will we still ensure people maintain connectedness with the community? So that's something that we also have to look at and consider. The survey also asked what can be improved in our community, something we look at very carefully, because we know that there is always work to be done to improving the way our community operates. The two most important influences that were identified was the cost of Jewish education and reducing religious divisions. Now, these were touched on by Rabbi Genendi when he spoke. The cost of Jewish education is something that is constantly raised with us. It's not something we have anything that we can any control over, but we're always happy to provide a forum for discussion of those sorts of issues. But we perhaps do have a role to play in the issue of reducing religious divisions. The JCCB seeks to represent the broadest possible cross-section of the community. We have membership, our affiliates are members of all religious communities other than the Haredi and ultra-Orthodox communities. And even those communities come together with other JCCB affiliate organisations to work on particular projects. And we also have affiliates which represent the more secular section of our community. So what the JCCB does, and will hopefully continue to do, is provide a forum where all of those who identify as Jewish can find a way of connecting with other people from within our community. And I think that some of the information that's in that the Gen17 survey will give us a framework for hopefully programs which will try and increase that connection over the years to come. I think that's just a quick summary of some of the issues that we've drawn out of the preliminary report, and looking forward to answering your questions later. Thank you.
I just want to start by thanking David Graham and Andrew Marcus and the whole team behind the Gen17 report for a really incredible effort behind it. It's an invaluable resource and it does impact our planning. I come with a very different perspective, I think, to many of the previous speakers, particularly from a younger generation, and I've tried to analyse the preliminary findings with a mind to the practical outcomes going forward and how to address some of the key challenges that we're seeing currently. Earlier this year, I was fortunate enough to visit many Jewish community organisations in America. And it was at the Birthright Israel Foundation that their CEO, Izzy Tabui, said to me, over the last 70 years, the fight was for Israel, and over the next 70 years, the fight will be for world Jewry. If there's one message I can leave you with tonight, it's that whilst there are great differences between the American and Australian Jewish communities, as with any diaspora Jewish community, the primary concern will always be continuity. We're doing far better than many other diaspora communities, but drilling deeper into the numbers, there are 4 key issues that underlie the central focus, particularly in relation to young people. They are 1, a sense of Jewish identity, 2, education, 3, marriage, and the 4th one, the ability to get young people involved in the community. So I'll deal with these one by one. On Jewish identity, we're generally becoming more secular and less observant. Nonetheless, in the age group of the 18 to 29-year-olds, those reporting being Jewish as a central element or a very important element of their identity has increased from 79% to 86% since the 2008 report. Those attending synagogue at least once a month has doubled since 1967 from 15% to 32%. And it'll be interesting to see the data on this broken down by age group. There's growing geographic concentration in Melbourne's Jewish community, which generally fosters a sense of communal life and identity. Broadly, the fundamentals in this space are very positive and appear to be improving. In the education space, we're seeing a slight decrease in those attending Jewish day schools, with only 51% attending. The cost of fees are growing significantly, well above general average wage rises, putting a formal Jewish education out of reach for too many. 32% said that the costs had prevented them from sending at least one child to a Jewish day school. 44% in Melbourne reported that the main disadvantage of sending children to day schools is the high cost of fees. 17% now report that other family members is a means of financing their children's education. That is, the grandparents are paying. Realistically, this means that shortly, the majority of the community will not attend day schools at all. We need to substantially bring down the costs of education and also increase the number of students we send on Israel programs post-high school. Israel programs will likely be the most impactful Jewish education experience those from non-Jewish day school backgrounds will ever receive in their lives. And it's also an extraordinarily cost-effective means of instilling a sense of Jewish identity and Jewish education. Interestingly, the Birthright Israel Foundation in America are reporting that those participating on the Birthright program, compared to those that do not participate on an Israel program at all, are 75% more likely to marry a Jewish partner, which leads me to the next key area affecting long-term continuity, intermarriage. We've seen a steady increase in the proportion of Jews marrying non-Jews over time, which sits at 33% today Australia-wide. This is double the rate it was in the 90s, but we are seeing a lower number in Melbourne at 26%. Geographic concentration, higher day school attendance, and a greater uptake in Israel programs post-high school are all likely major factors here. For many, intermarriage is considered almost a taboo, with 55% saying they would feel some regret or very considerable regret if one of their children were to marry a non-Jewish partner. Now, I believe we need to be clear-eyed on this issue. The reality is that this is occurring. Intermarriage will likely continue to rise steadily over time, and as communal behaviour changes, this will necessitate attitudinal shifts. We will need to become more inclusive and welcoming as a community. The reality is that the children of mixed faith households will often grow up Jewish and with a strong and proud sense of Jewish identity. If we fail to become more inclusive and welcoming, we risk losing these members of our community who would otherwise become passionate advocates. And the fourth key issue is the failure in many pockets to get younger people involved in our established community organisations. I believe there are two main issues here: a lack of understanding regarding changing values amongst young people, and millennials in particular, and a community institutional framework that does not offer enough local services and was largely built for an older generation. In many respects, the narrative around young people's attitudes is pitted with contradictions and dichotomies. Israel has become so central to modern Jewish identity for young people, and yet they are less likely to prioritise giving to Israel causes or feel a personal responsibility to ensure that the state of Israel continues to exist. They feel a stronger sense of Jewish identity, yet are less likely to get involved in community organisations, and are more likely to marry non-Jewish partners. The Jewish community does not exist in a vacuum, and the trends seen amongst younger generations, particularly millennials, are just as evident in our community. Younger generations are more likely to be globalists rather than tribalists, with the reverse being true for older generations. It's important to understand that the J in any community organisation's name is generally seen as inclusionary amongst older generations, as including all Jews. But to younger generations, it's a sign of exclusion, that one people are allowed to enter, but not others. It is this trend that is key to understanding participation rates in the community. Young people want to be connected through a more vibrant arts and culture scene in an inclusive and diverse manner. Our community has generally lacked this. Orges, Stand Up, Launchpad and the Australian Jewish Funders are doing some incredible work in this space, but there's always more to be done. Looking overseas, the Jewish community in London has recently built JW3, which is the first Jewish community centre of its kind, boasting thousands of events each year in arts and culture, adult education, as well as providing office spaces for their community organisations. In its first year, 225,000 people had passed through its doors, and 1,500 had attended education classes each week. This is the major gap in our community's infrastructure: the ability to target the 25 to 40-year-old age group. And I believe this will be central to the long-term success and effectiveness of our community organisations and the vibrance of Jewish communal life in Australia. We're an incredible community and continue to punch above our weight. And there is an enormous amount that does unite us. But there are challenges ahead, and challenges that I believe can be addressed. But it's why I firmly agree with Izzy Tupui that over the last 7 years, the fight was for Israel, and over the next 7 years, the fight will be for world Jewry.
Okay, well, thank you. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. Each with very important insights. All right, so it's now open to questions, but really want to emphasise this is not an opportunity for you to make a statement, it's an opportunity for you to ask a question. If people want to make statements, there's various fora, including if you want to send us emails, we'll put them up on the website, and this will be your statement, but these are now for questions.
Could I ask one question? Actually, it is a question. We're sitting here in a forum that is conducted by the Australian Centre for Jewish Civilisation. Why is it that when the Australian Centre for Jewish Civilisation has evening meetings with the most interesting speakers who come here, we see very few young people present? Hardly any at all. Yet when I go to a meeting of the Classical Association of Victoria at Melbourne University on an academic subject, like it would be an academic subject here, there are many young people here. There are undergraduates who attend. Here the undergraduates seem not to be interested. Why is that the case?
Okay, well, there's certainly a lot of young people here today, but Daniel, do you want to... But the point is, in general, that would be, I think, true. So, Daniel?
I think broadly comes down to how people perceive fun. How they perceive fun. Older generations tend to engage on an intellectual level with speakers and things that are more intellectually stimulating. Younger generations tend to want to have a more arts and cultural scene. So when we run events through, or just say on any campus, the events that bring great numbers, and anything that you're intending, if you bring any barbecue that you bring out, you'll have 400 people lined up to be on the campus. And the reality is that that does connect people. It's important to understand that the way people connect is different through different generations. Older generations, they will connect and they'll hear this speak and they'll say, wow, that was fantastic. Do you think about this? Do you think about that? Younger generations will stand there next to a barbecue and they'll say, oh, like, how's your family, whatever it is that's going on. And they'll connect through community in a very different manner. And it's not to say that young people are apathetic. They're still there.
Okay. Anyone else want to make a comment? No. All right, next. Paul.
Paul Gardner. If we believe that projects like Birthright and other things that help people go and visit Israel, if we believe that's important, and if, as Jennifer has said, we're not in the capacity in Victoria to engage in a joint communal appeal as we have in New South Wales, and if it's true, as I think it's true, that there isn't enough funding to really help these programs along, I'd like the panel to answer the question, what precisely is it that is stopping this community from even considering seriously the notion of a joint communal appeal?
Yeah.
A number of previous presidents of the JCCV, far greater calibre than me, have spent many hours working with various different community organisations and philanthropic foundations within our community to try and establish a Jewish community appeal. And to be honest, it would appear that the large organisations and the large foundations aren't in favour of it. Now, I've heard various different perspectives. I've been told that people think that it is beneficial not to have a Jewish community appeal, because although you get the benefit of the strategic planning, it also stifles innovation and creativity, and that we get a lot more of that in the Victorian Jewish community than in New South Wales. Now, I'm not an expert on comparing the two communities. I do know that, as I said, that the evidence have shown through past efforts that there isn't the support for it in Victoria generally. So you would have to speak to those organisations and those foundations to find out why they don't support it, but that is the evidence of the previous attempts to get a Jewish community appeal up in Victoria.
Okay, David in the back.
I'm here. David Bruce. I'm a long-time social planner and have been involved in working with a whole range of communities who give their eye teeth for this survey. If the Vietnamese and the Afghan Hazaras I've recently been working with had this data, they would run to government with a whole range of requests. And it's a legacy that Andrew's leaving to this community for the long term, and he should be blessed for the work he's put in. However, I want to challenge that statement that service planning is linked with fundraising. Infrastructure Australia plans for infrastructure has nothing to do with where the funding is coming from. And we see that in the fights that exist across governments and political parties to allocate resources. But there is a central planning process. And it seems to me that the Jewish Community Council of Victoria does have that responsibility, because it has got persuasive power to take this data and ensure where are the priorities for service planning and service development into the future. It's easy, as we've seen tonight with respect, to cherry pick what you want out of this survey to meet your own purposes. But what we need is holistic service planning to ensure that for all demographic segments within the community, regardless of their observance, regardless of where they live in Victoria, not just in Melbourne, not just in the southeastern suburbs, but in the western suburbs, in the northern suburbs, in Bendigo, in other areas, that the Community Council gets up and provides the leadership to ensure that there is a strong social planning focus using this data and is persuasive on the donors and other people, many of whom are good-hearted, but some of whom are interested in edifices. Thank you. The question is, why can't they have it?
Bill Rubenstein. As you know, I have quite a few methodological problems.
Just 1 second.
I'm sorry.
Look, you make a couple of valid points. Look, there's a couple of valid points, but we have on a number of occasions brought community organisations together and tried to establish that planning separate from fundraising. And unfortunately, it's been unsuccessful because the community organisations haven't bought into that process. Now, you cite the example of Infrastructure Australia. Yes, Infrastructure Australia is funded to produce those plans, but firstly it requires funds to actually produce the plans. That's the first thing. We don't have funds to produce a strategic plan. It takes time, it takes personnel, and the JCSV definitely doesn't have the funding to do that. Secondly, Infrastructure Australia, if you want to take that analogy a little bit further, and I'm not trying to be negative, but I'm just trying to answer the question that you've raised. I'd rather look at more positive aspects of where we can go with this information, but you've raised this issue, so I will. And to take that analogy further, Infrastructure Australia sets out what it sees as the priority, but nothing in that priority actually happens until a particular government allocates funding for it. And that is, if we had the funding to prepare a strategic plan, we would be very happy to sit down and work with community organisations to prepare a plan. You'd need to employ the staff to do it. And then we would say, well, we think you should do it, but then the individual community organisations have the responsibility to determine if that's where they want to allocate their funding.
You have been selected to do it. Why do you need money?
I'm sorry, I'm a volunteer.
Well, let the volunteers do it.
Hello, is this working? Okay, thanks, Andrew. As you know, I have a number of methodological problems with the survey, but I just want to ask one question about intermarriage. Do you include people who subsequently convert to Judaism after intermarriage as intermarriage? What happens to them?
So the data on intermarriage is a question in the survey which is about household composition. And we're able to actually disaggregate households as opposed to individuals, so we're not double counting. Yep. And the question asked, is your partner Jewish? So that's how we get that at that particular point in time, is your partner Jewish? We also have information on conversion. Now, I don't actually see that the findings on intermarriage are in any way controversial because we have data in the census. Now, presuming the census data is reliable, we're actually getting less intermarriage in Gen17 than is indicated by the census data.
Hi, good evening. I also want to thank the ACJC and Associated for the survey. I wear a few different hats, but the one I just want to talk about now is as a Limwood organiser. So Limwood is, and just to reflect something very quickly, Limwood is one sort of forum. It's only a pop-up event where there is diversity, cross-communal events, pluralism. What I've noticed in the community is that it's much easier to get support, just and that from that Limwood perspective and others, it's much easier to get support for a partisan position or a partisan organisation. So all the panellists have talked about the need for more diversity and more tolerance. But it's actually really hard. Everybody supports partisan things, a specific religious perspective, a specific political perspective. But there isn't a single ongoing institution in Victoria that supports cross-communal and across the board events compared to, say, New South Wales, where at least there's the Shalom Institute. And I'd be really interested in panellists' views on how community energy can be going to not just what's good for my turf, but what's good for a broader turf, cross-communal experience.
Okay, maybe over there. Zeddy, would you like to go?
I think 100% that's perhaps the most valuable point that's come out of this evening. I mean, I talked about schisms that are reflected in the newspaper, and I think it's reflected across the community. Everybody thinks it's their community and only their voice should be heard. And likewise, everybody thinks the AJN, it's their paper and only their voice should be heard. And every week I'll hear from somebody who says, I'm from Bialik, why are you only writing about Scopus? I'm from Scopus, why are you only writing about Bialik? I'm from Torrexel, why are you only writing about TBI? I'm from TBI, why are you only writing about Torrexel? I'm from JNF, why are you only writing about UIA? I'm from UIA, why are you writing about JNF? I like cheese, why aren't you writing about cheese? I like chocolate, why aren't you writing about chocolate? I'm Michael Danby, why aren't you writing about me? And I think that is, as we've heard, that is reflected across the community. I think the work that Limud does is invaluable, and we try to reflect that within the newspaper. I mean, you say there's no organisation within the community that tries to reflect all these views. As a newspaper, as you know, we do try to reflect all those views, and everybody hates us because of it, because we're promoting views that they don't agree with. And I think, the JCCB, it does try to be inclusive. And, people like Rabbi Genendi, they do try to be inclusive, but obviously the very nature of Caulfield Shul is it's an Orthodox shul, and therefore certain people will feel disenfranchised from it. But yes, we have the Shalom Institute in Sydney, we have Limud here. It would be fantastic if there was, as we heard earlier, an organisation like JW3, like they have in London, which is just a big cross-communal organisation that organises events across the community, that does really affect everybody and does pull everybody in. And if there could be an ongoing Limud that goes throughout the year rather than just one weekend of the year, I think that would be fantastic.
Yeah. I may just add is that I do think that there are different organisations that are trying to reach out, and I think that we as Orthodox, yes, we are limited and restricted within it, but it comes down to the organisation, and youth movements, looking at Unani right over there, to try to say how can we reach out and not only just speak about our own needs. We're an incredibly feudal community, and that's why I think a joint kind of community appeal is so hard. And there is actually a strength in our feudalism, is that our organisations and the various organisations do incredibly well, and maybe one of the arguments against having a communal fundraising is that we raise more money than is raised in Sydney, and that if we actually did it together we would raise less money. So maybe we are able to do more and able to express even more diversity, but it is a problem in that I agree that our feudal attitude does sometimes, it's just about our organisation and not what's best for all of us.
Interested to know, out of the people who responded to say that they had intermarried, did you explore how many of them were committed to raising Jewish children? You did? Okay. And also, like, conversely, the couples that were married to other Jewish people, did you explore how many of them were not committed to raising Jewish children?
So you understand this is just preliminary report. We got it out very quickly. But if you've got issues like that, we really welcome it. We'd like, send us an email saying we'd actually like to see this cross or this analysis. But David actually included in the report comparing attitudes to a whole range of issues where the couples were, one partner was Jewish, another one was not, and both were. And it's very interesting to see that there's quite a huge difference in attitudes. But it's a cause and an effect issue, is it? Like, are their attitudes different because they're in an intermarriage relationship, or are they in an intermarriage relationship because their attitudes to start with were fundamentally different? So that's a very difficult one to deal with, that one. Thank you for that. And anyone who would like to see any particular analysis, just send us an email to Monash and we'll try and follow up.
First of all, congratulations on the report. I think there was very good commentary from Daniel about the very big issues that are facing the Jewish community going forward. And I'd like to hear from each panellist individually that it's such a serious issue, surely there should be some sort of long-term strategic plan to address and ensure those issues that Daniel has identified and the report has identified that despite the money, despite all the politics involved, it's just such an important issue.
Sure. Look, I think broadly the community organisations do a good job in terms of cross-collaboration. In terms of, like, in Beth Wiseman's prime example, every community organisation will walk through our doors at some point every day. And it's about understanding where each organisation is positioning themselves. How can we work together in order to overcome those challenges? Funding generally isn't the issue, whether or not it's a centralised model or not. Where you look at the funding allocations broadly are between Sydney and Melbourne, they're very similar. We do have more innovation coming through Melbourne, so it is something to be quite positive about. I think in large part it's just more cross-collaboration between the organisations.
One thing I think is very important is getting younger people involved in the planning with each individual organisation, and I know there are a number of Jewish community organisations who are working towards that end. The JCCV, our board has 3 members in their 20s. We think that's very important because they're the future of our community and they are very much involved in our strategic planning moving forward. And I think that by and young people in their 30s and 40s as well, and 50s. We even have one member in her 60s. So we do cover the breadth of the community in terms of that age demographic. But in particular, we were very concerned to get younger members of our executive so that they would be involved in all of our activities and play a key role so that those issues that have been raised by Daniel are addressed in our programming. And I know that there are a number of other Jewish community organisations who are working to try and improve engagement with younger members of the community, and I commend others to do the same thing. Because I think only by getting younger people involved will we really be able to address their concerns.
Engaging young people is absolutely integral to the work of New Israel Fund. We've got a board of 8 members, 3 members are in their 30s and they're female, and they are absolutely extraordinary, and one of them sitting here in the hall tonight. We have a fellowship program, which is also one of the most important aspects of our work. And the fellowship program, we just did interviews today actually, linking up with Sydney, interviewing people who have applied to go to Israel for a couple of weeks and then to be involved in programming in Australia, in Sydney and in Melbourne. And for them, our hope is that we are building the next generation of leaders for our community, but we also work with other parts of the Jewish community. Last year we partnered with the Temple, TBI for the Noah's visit from Israel. We've had other collaborations with other groups, and I agree that we are a pluralistic community. We are, I don't like using the term feudal, but we have lots and lots of different communities, which is the way I like to express it in my presentation. And engaging the young is the challenge, and something that we take very seriously because it's building the future of the community. So engaging the young is central.
And I would add that the young need to engage us. We want the young people to engage with us who are the oldies, who have got the existing institutions that have been built up with so much blood and money and sweat and tears of there. We've got existing structures. And so the young people come out, take them over, refashion them, reshape them, revision them. Why create something new? We have got incredible energy among the young people in this community, across this community. There's just so much happening where young people are driving and are leading the way already that we haven't even mentioned. I mean, you just look around, the account for this, I can think of several that just came to my mind. You know, I'm thinking of Stand Up, I'm thinking of Zuz, I'm thinking of Spirit Grow, I'm thinking of our youth movements. There's an incredible amount already happening. So what we need to do is say the young people come and engage with us. It's not up to us to engage with you only. You are the future. Come and engage, challenge, and tell us where you want to go.
Just as well as echoing what everybody else has said about engaging the young and the young engaging these organisations, I think one of the problems that we have, particularly maybe in Melbourne, is just the people who actually lead our organisations. It seems to be a revolving door of the same people at the head of our roof bodies year after year, swapping places, whether it's Danny Lamb and Robert Goot, alternating between the Zionist Federation and the Executive Council of Australian Jewry. It always seems to be the same old faces at the top. If you just compare in Sydney, where the Board of Deputies there, the two most recent leaders have been relatively young. You've had your Ian Miller and now you've got Jeremy Spinack, both of whom are kind of in their 30s/40s rather than people who are in their 60s and 70s. And I think as a result of that, you get young people setting up their own organisations. You get things like Stand Up because they do feel to an extent disenfranchised and they have to set up their own organisations. So what I think we need to do, as well as engaging young people, is actually have the young people in the leadership positions. We can't keep having Danny Lamb as president of this organisation. I'm not trying to do Danny down, he does a tremendous job, and it's great that there are people like him that are taking these leadership positions, but we need young people to actually step forward and take these leadership positions. And if that means Danny Lamb steps down and says, I'm not going to be president of this organisation this year, I think that would be a fantastic thing. And that's not to be quoted in the Jewish news.
I just want to say, I don't want to criticise Eddie because he's got a particular view and it's quite valuable in some ways, but the current president of the ACJ is in their 40s. I'm definitely not in my 60s yet. And if one of the issues is actually, and the reason why there's a difference between the JCCB and the Board of Deputies, the JCCB spends a lot of its time and effort fundraising, and a lot of young people want to do interesting work and not fundraise. The Board of Deputies in New South Wales does not fundraise because it is given its funding by the JCA, so that the people who, and in fact the last president of the JCA has told, the Board of Deputies told me if he had to fundraise, he would not have taken on the role because he's interested in doing things other than that. And most young people don't want to spend their time fundraising. It's not very exciting, it's not very interesting. They want to get out there and do programming and run projects. But unfortunately, we have to spend a lot of our time actually paying the bills. And that's one of the biggest differences. So yes, we are innovative in Victoria because we don't have a JCA. We have a lot of different organisations flourishing. But the key difference is the roof body. Now, the question is whether or not you consider that important. And that's a matter of priority for the community. And I'm not saying whether it's good or bad, I'm just pointing out the reason for the differences.
My question's for Andrew. I'm David White, I'm president of South Caulfield Hebrew Congregation. We probably have the youngest board of any of the established schools at the moment. A lot going on there. I didn't sign up to fundraise, so if anyone in the audience wants to give me some cash or cheques afterwards, please come. My question's about property prices, which dovetails into the affordability of Jewish schools. Anecdotally, younger Jewish families are moving east and northeast. We definitely feel like the streets are literally lined with mezuzahs, as we say, and it literally is. But when you put up that chart before on suburbs the Jews were living in, it didn't look like there was that much change. I was wondering what data suggests where Jews are living, because the big question is, yes, we have a lot of community infrastructure, is it in the wrong place? The A-Root's moving northeast. So where are the facilities?
So just very quickly, it's surprising because that's our sort of street cred, isn't it, that people can't afford to live there. But the actual census indicates increasing concentration. And it's pretty clear on that. We're much more highly concentrated than Sydney. Now 54% of the Jews live in Glenora. So maybe there's a problem with the census, but certainly that's what the data tells us.
This is a question for Rebecca Randy. I don't know how thoroughly it was covered in the census, but I was wondering if with the increase in acceptance of coming out, what was being done to include, I guess, the more religious Jewish people who are queer, and how it could be expanded to include, to be more inclusive space for queer Jewish people. I was brought up modern Orthodox, and I would like to have a space in the modern Orthodox community, and I feel like it's something that would help mitigate intermarriage. I strongly believe that a lot of young people who are marrying outside the Jewish community are doing so because of their sexuality.
Very, very good.
Thanks for that question. I think that my views on this are quite well known, and that I do believe that the Orthodox, and certainly our modern Orthodox community in particular, should be more accepting, inclusive, and find ways of engaging people in the GLBTI community. It is not something that our shul is. It's a wide representation you have, as Zedi has pointed out, and certainly within a well-established shul like Corfu Shul, you don't have a whole range of opinions there, and views on the subject. But nevertheless, in terms of my leadership, and I do believe that it is something that is supported by my president here tonight. So if he doesn't jump up, and I'm sure he won't, because I believe that the board itself would want to support and help people, help GLBTI to feel included within the Orthodox community. I think it is one of the challenges, and that is why we invited Rabbi Stephen to last year, who's a gay Orthodox rabbi. Although some told me that's a contradiction, but he is Orthodox. He lives an Orthodox life, and we invited him to the shul despite, and the board were fully behind me, despite a lot of opposition. And this is one of the ways that we believe we can respond to that issue, and we're very happy to engage more dialogue with yourself and others like you, because we'd like to do more.
So we're getting out of time. Just one last question there. Thank you. Oh, sorry. I've got two questions. One, make this very quick, please.
Andrew.
All right. Yes.
This one for the news editor. As I'm trying to read a bit every week your paper, I'm just wondering, I'm reading a lot of news from Israel on a daily basis from a few different resources. And sometimes I find half-truth and even lies in your newspaper. and when they come in, let's say now with the refugee crisis, you talked about it in Israel. And there was even some guy that wrote about it.
Sorry, it's not about the survey. This is a discussion not about the Jewish, it's about the survey. Have you got a question about the survey?
All right. No, just...
Take that as a comment, yeah?
No, I just want to ask him what's the... I'll ask you.
Sorry.
Must be true if you read the Jewish news.
As a North Side Jew, I do know that there are quite a number of Jews living in the northern suburbs, and they do have some very interesting Jewish activities. So there's a Northside Jewish Club, there's a Northside Yiddish Club. It is quite a discrete area, yet I wonder if it was captured in your survey? Because I noticed in the slide that had the suburbs, there was absolutely no mention of any north side suburbs.
The Jewish population is highly concentrated, and the trend that the census tells us is that those populations have shrunk. So I'm sorry, but that's what sort of the data.
A lot of younger people are coming to the north.
But we'll look at that again, yes? Now there were just a couple of questions here and then we're finished, so yes, thank you.
Hi, my name is Elise, I'm 22 and I went to Yavna, I'm a Melbourne Jewish boy, and now that I'm towards the last year of my involvement in the youth movement and I've been a leader in the youth movement, begs the question for myself is, as a leader in the Jewish community, where next? And I seriously respect all the people up here, but probably besides Daniel's organisation, I don't feel like there's an in or forum for people as myself, and there's a lot of people who are passionate leaders in this community who would love to take on some sort of role. I don't see a path. So if you could share a path or how you think other organisations could have a path for us, that'd be great.
It is a difficult question because what you're probably looking for is not to sit on a committee but to actually do something constructive. And a lot of organisations involve sitting on committees, which I know is not particularly attractive. But I think there are a lot of organisations out there that are running projects that I think that they would really like younger people involved with. And I don't want to go into too much detail. I'm happy to have a chat with you later about some of the range of things that are happening in the community that you might be interested in getting involved with, because I think there is really a lot out there. But it's up to young people. I think Ralph said it's not just for us to engage with young people, but young people to engage with the older people. And so I guess and I know that there are different ways of approaching the world, and I know that each generation looks at the world differently. But I know through some of the programs that Australian Jewish funders operate and some of the other organisations, there is somewhere to go. And I'm happy to have a chat with you afterwards to see if we can explore some of what some of those projects might be.
I think that is a really important question, and it's something that we're taking very seriously and trying to find ways to meet. And our fellowship program, which I mentioned before, is one way to recruit people who have been in the youth movements, and then very often there's a hiatus between leaving the youth movement and then possibly coming back in their 30s or 40s. And we try and arrange programming that's going to attract younger people with film nights and speakers who will engage young people. But I agree with you, it's a big challenge and it's something that we talk about often.
And I'd say to you, if you're sitting two seats away from our president, we want you on our board. But seriously, you're the kind of person, and we are part of what we did years ago. We, like many, and I agree with both the previous speakers, there are organisations, and previously we set up something called INCA 572 several years ago, just for that purpose, saying how do we, that's why we aimed at specifically first 23 to 30 something, because of that very purpose, because we knew until that point they're involved, they're engaged in youth movements and other things, but it's that critical age then. I think there are quite a few organisations addressing it. We're trying to do the same thing at Caulfield Shul, which you are familiar with the Shul, and we want you.
Yep. Final comment.
Thank you for the question, Ellie. I think it's one of the most important questions at the moment. If you look at the institutional framework of our community, it's largely been created for an older generation. In large part, there is somewhat of a vacuum for those aged between 25 and 40. And there are many people that come through the youth movements or through Zuz or through Orges and then suddenly realise, what's next? And a lot of them do disappear off the face of the earth for quite a while before some come back into many other community organisations and some don't. Ralph, I just wanted to respond to something you said earlier in terms of, you said why create something new, get involved in the established institutions, reform them, reshape them. And in large part that's what young people do need to do. But it's also recognition that there is a missing link for many people, and the Australian Jewish Funders is doing a lot in this space, and I think it's incumbent on young people to engage with them primarily in this area to establish something that actually works for that demographic.
Okay, so unfortunately time's run out. Thank you very much for participating, which certainly for me was a stimulating discussion. I just want to thank the panellists. And just to re-emphasise the point that I regard this as an amazingly rich resource for the community, but it's only as good as the questions that we use to interrogate the data. So if you're sitting there and you think, I'd like to see this, I'd like to see that, please email us. We won't be able to do it immediately, but we will get on to that and try and provide those perspectives. Thank you very much.